Okay, so first, good job, Mary Catherine.
Thank
And in general, I'm just going to open up the floor. You and I have talked about several things, but if they don't have questions, then I have some questions. So if either one of you want to start, go ahead and feel free to take the floor. And if you need her to pull up her slides, we can sure do that again as well. But I believe she shared her slides with you too. So yeah.
So I do have a couple of questions. Nice job.
you.
And nice job talking about the methodology, because I know it's not always easy to talk about. There's lots of weeds with qualitative research. So nice job sorting through the weeds. I don't know what happened to Dr. Osborne. Do you want me to wait?
Did you lose him?
I think he just dropped off.
Okay.
But
Do you want me to wait?
Hopefully he'll come back. We're going to record it, so I can just share the recording with everybody. So
Okay.
that'll work. Yeah.
Okay, so my first question is I saw the demographic questionnaire and I just wasn't sure how you were planning on using the demographic information. Because I guess my question is, do you plan on including it with the qualitative findings, or do you just plan on it like helping provide context to the people that are part of your study? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I think we had discussed, Dr. Fraser and I had discussed like separating like men from women, if we wanted to do like a follow-up study after we were done, like the mood study and things like that we had talked about. It doesn't have to be included in there if it's not going to be necessary, if that makes sense.
Well, I think the reason it could become an issue is not so much the information that you're asking, but your interview questions are really long. There's a lot of them. And there's a lot of similar information being asked in both formats that I feel like for clarity's sake, you could ask in one format or the other, and it would shorten your interview. Or I should say keep it on time, because I don't think you would be able to do the interview that you've designed in the amount of time that you've designed it for.
Okay.
People get off track real easy.
Right.
So 15 questions, 16 questions in 45 minutes is a lot.
Right.
So like there's questions about, let's see, like how long did your return to learn process take in the interview? And then you ask how many days did it take in the survey. So I think you could just do it in one place and then you've got that information. But the reason I'm asking in particular is that if you use the quantitative data as part of your qualitative findings, like to separate them out and say like the people that were out of participation for a longer period of time had these experiences, that's no longer solely purely qualitative, right? That's mixed method, which is fine, right? If that's the route that you guys want to go, that's totally fine. But you still do the qualitative part exactly how you've designed it, but then you also have to talk about the quantitative part, if that makes sense.
So would you recommend taking it out completely?
I think it adds value,
Okay.
right? But that's also coming from somebody that loves mixed methods research. So, but I think you're just, I think it's great information, but whenever you add that, like, are these people different than these people, right? That's something that then you have to saturate both of those groups.
Okay.
Right? So you end up having to collect more interviews because you have to be able to strongly say these people are different than this one. Their experiences are different than this one. And you can only do that if both of those groups are saturated. So if you want to look at differences based on how long they were out, or if they didn't have social support, or if they didn't have something else, then we just need to make sure and make those decisions up front, because it's not that your workload is more in terms of like your chapters. It doesn't really change a whole lot about your chapters. but it just means you have to collect more, which means you have more data to analyze, which means it takes more time, those types of things.
Can I ask a question before she answers? So one of the things that that she and I talked about was not necessarily grouping people, but maybe just using like some of those things as descriptives as what they're doing. So not like you're only out for 7 days and you're out for a month or greater, but just kind of like, because we do think, well, I think, and I think Mary Catherine thinks the same thing, that we're going to see a gradation of answers. And so potentially saying, people reported differences in social support, and not that these were like grouped into variables and quantitatively compared. But just in knowing that not everybody had the same amount of time loss, or not everybody had the same amount of social support, was a mediator in some of these findings, because
That's totally fine.
I think that that's maybe the better, like the continuous running scale of looking at it, instead of like this group versus this group. So I think, again, that's our assumption that that's what's going to happen, but we don't know for sure. So, and plus then it makes it harder to recruit people, because then we're like, okay, so you have to be better in this amount of time or this amount of time. And then we miss all the people in the middle too, which also like cuts out potential participants. So
I 100% agree. And that makes it definitely cleaner and easier. And I think that just means that you have to be really cautious of how you talk about the quantitative information, because you're not using it to test things. You're not using it to decide differences. You're not using it to do any of that. You're just contextualizing your population. That's all that you're doing with that information. So as long as that's clear, that's totally fine. That's just something that is one of those things that can get you in trouble quickly if you don't have a plan for that. Because you're like, oh, this is interesting, let's look at this. But you can't look at that if it's not saturated.
Well, I wanted to add a little bit there. I'm sorry, my internet dropped, so I missed a bit of that conversation. But I was actually glad to come back in at the point where it was being talked about. I love mixed method studies myself too, but I don't think you want to go there.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
It's too big, and I actually think that a qualitative approach is so needed here, and I just think that there's such a good opportunity for you to do that. So I'm really glad to hear that kind of a focus. I love the fact that you're going to ask those demographic questions and things like that, because I think that thinking about using them in a descriptive way is absolutely the way to go. And I actually see there being an opportunity in the discussion for you to bring more of those descriptives in as you talk about what future research might need to do. So normally people will use those descriptives to kind of set up their quantitative analyses. I almost see you using the descriptives after having discussed the qualitative data to set a sort of an agenda for like return to play thing, or return to learn steps that universities need to consider and things like that. So I think it gives you an opportunity to do some speculating maybe based on those descriptives. But I agree that I think you want to be very cautious, and it sounds like Dr. Kosman will do a really good job of helping keep us honest about that, about not
She will, don't worry.
language. So yeah.
She will.
So we're not using that data in any sort of analytical ways, because you wouldn't have the ability to do that. But it's easy to slip in that language.
I think Dr. Osborne's right on though, because you're going to write this up and be like, we found all of these great things, right? Like these are all things that influence their experience, but we can't answer maybe whose experience is worse. So that's the next step, or who struggles with X, Y, and Z. That's the next step. So it sets yourself up really nicely too, selfishly, to be able to take those next steps without a whole lot of extra effort. So it's okay to be selfish too, because this is a thesis.
Yeah. Also, I want to make sure that I'm clear too, the things in the descriptive or in the demographic thing at the end, all of the like mood behavioral questionnaires. I added on there. And again, we can hopefully use that for additional stuff, but that's not something that's going to be a part of her portion of it. But
Okay.
I think that gives us the ability to discuss that stuff later. And that's why you don't see all those things included in her lit review and in her
Yeah.
methodology and stuff, is because I just thought that that was a good opportunity for us maybe to do a little bit more of a mixed methods thing or something like that after. But as you guys said, that would be a lot for her to do. So yeah.
Yeah. I saw the aggression scale and I was like, oh, that's Missy.
I'm also a firm believer of adding things. You know, you've got this group that you're going to reach out to, and when you have the opportunity to do that, you know, it gather more data. You know, I'm a firm believer in adding, but being clean about what you are analyzing as it relates to the set of questions that you have for this particular thesis project. And I think that if you keep that, you know, real clean and real straight, then you might have other opportunities for working with data beyond the thesis that have, you know, some other opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's perfectly okay.
That leads me to one other question, Dr. Fraser, specifically about that addendum piece to it, just from the context of recruitment, because in theory, you only have to do 15 interviews, right? But that's not going to give you a whole lot of info on those other topics that you're interested in. So are you going to recruit anybody that's eligible and send them that survey and then pick the interviewees?
Mhm.
Okay, so you can get more data.
Yeah.
So then you'll just want to make sure in your chapters, and I'll make this comment in there, but you'll just want to make sure that you talk about how you pick those people. Like, are you randomly selecting them? Are you selecting them in particular because they are a male and you're trying to have balance between males and female? Like, you just want to make sure that since you are picking, that you've got a method to the madness.
Okay. I'm gonna make some notes.
But then that'll also give you a lot more data.
Yeah.
The quantitative part.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate you bringing that point up. And she and I had kind of talked about it, but we hadn't really like selected a way to do that, because our hope is, fingers crossed, to get, you know, a lot of people that are interested in doing it. Yeah, and then the other thing, actually, it's not so much a question for Mary Catherine, but more for the committee. So we said like 24, heard me, months, like within 24 months, right? For their inclusion. So one of the things that we spoke about is like, as they come in, like if somebody's at 23 months and we think we want to use them, we need to like hurry up and do that. But, you know, do y'all have like suggestions on what we should look at, or what would, because what we talked about was, initially she talked about just doing football, but we talked about that it'd be better to have a wider breadth of individuals, not just males, but females, but especially since there's been such a push to look at female athletes. And so but I don't know, like, should we be trying to balance them out, kind of like male, female, contact, non-contact, like that kind of stuff, because they're all going to be college age. So it's a pretty narrow age range. So I don't think age will be such a big deal, but more, or do you think like it doesn't matter if they're contact, non-contact? I think getting a closer balance of male, female would be great. I don't know that we have to like necessarily go every other person, but if y'all have thoughts on that, or if Mary Catherine, you've thought more about it, I think now would be a good time to discuss that. Sorry to like just throw that out there, but
no. I think there's pros and cons to both of those methods. I think you can probably do it easier than you think, in terms of like, if you are just analyzing the data, you can kind of inadvertently say, well, this is generally what people said, but several females brought up this particular challenge, or like, you can make those statements. So I don't know if it necessarily needs to be intentional unless you're trying to specifically compare differences. but there's value in it being generalizable because, like you mentioned, you want this to be reflective of all of their experiences. And so I think like random sampling is great, right? But that doesn't always, you might get all the football players, which isn't really that helpful. And so I think having a strategic method is not necessarily a bad thing, but I wouldn't necessarily restrict it to gender, right? Like you might want to just try to get a variety, whether that's an equal split or not, of year in school or timing since concussion or age or gender or whatever it might be, just to try to be as representative as you can. And probably the easiest split for that is gender, just because of the fact that they're going to play different sports, right? So you know you're going to get at least different sports. And so you'll at least have the gender and sport differences. Because like you mentioned, it's a tight window. Age probably matters less than like time since concussion. Because I would imagine you're probably going to see more things with those that have been, that it's more recent than those that have been longer term. So if you're going to restrict by like a years, that's probably the years I would go by, not age. But I think just being like, you're going to have all those demos to pull from, right? And you're going to be able to pick your interviewees. And so I think just saying like, writing it in a way that gives you the flexibility to say, oh, well, we just selected 5 males in a row. Let's go for a female this time. Like if we can write it up in a way that gives you that flexibility.
Yeah. One of the things, and this might have been brought up when I was trying to reconnect, but depending on the number of interviews, you know, did you talk about a specific number? I heard 15, but
I think that's what I saw in the chapters, but I also may have made that up in my head.
I think we just said we would take them to exhaustion. So whenever they run out, and I told her, you know, we could be done at 5. I doubt it, but, or we could be done at whatever number it takes, which is one of the reasons why I would like for her to start doing the interviews sooner than later, because it takes a while to recruit them, but more so to do all the transcription and coding and stuff like that. And so I want to make sure that she has ample time to get that done. The good news is summer gives a lot more availability for that, but still.
One thing you could do too is you don't have to saturate your group since you're not directly comparing your groups, but just for representation purposes, you could say we're going to aim for 20 interviews and we're going to have 5 males, 5 females, 5 like different combinations, like 5 males recent, 5 males longer, 5 females recent, 5 females longer. And since you're not doing direct comparisons of them, saturation doesn't necessarily matter. That's just a way to be more strategic about your sampling.
Yeah, that's actually what I was going to recommend, because you're not trying to make comparisons necessarily between the groups. I think that a strategy of having a sort of a blended set of interviews, I don't know if that's the right word to use, but because if I've been trying to think about how to explain this, but unless you have a specific reason to think that the return to learn and return to play process would be dramatically different depending on which sport they participate in, or whether or not it was 23 months ago versus 7 months ago, and I don't think there's reasons to think that, is there? Then it seems like you would want to have a strategy that is more, a little bit more mindful. And I think gender is absolutely a good way to do that. And I like the idea of, you know, more recent, like, you know, within the last 12 months versus, you know, 13 to 24 months or something. And just, you know, pull as even a number for those 2 groups, if you will. It end up being 4 groups, I guess, as you can.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily matter then if you stop at 15, right? And say you have 3 in this group, 4 in this group, 3 in this group, 5 in this group. That does, because you're not making the comparisons.
Right.
So
you're looking for those themes to emerge. Mm-hmm.
Right. But the other thing that I think might be a strategy you want to use, and just one to think about, is contact versus non-contact may give you some, because people tend to be a little bit more loosey-goosey with RTP for non-contact because they think you don't really get hurt that often, right? So Like if you think about a golf person with a concussion, right? Their return to play, even though it's the same steps, their return to play process is probably a lot more lax than somebody playing football.
Yeah.
I would hope, honestly.
I don't know. I've talked to some people that have come from some other universities and I was like, they did what? Cool. Okay. That's super scary.
But I think having that clarification, one on the sampling, but two on the how that quantitative information is going to be used is really, really helpful, because in your interview script, there's a lot of yes, no types of questions or things that could be answered yes, no, or with a category in a survey. And I think that's part of what's adding to how long your interview questions are. So I think there's a way to collapse several questions into one by taking out some of that quantitative information, because you're already going to have it, right? So instead of like, tell me, like, how long were you out? You could say, well, tell me about the process of your return to learn. Was it easy? Was it hard? Like that type of, just kind of collapse it. And that'll help make it shorter, but it'll also help make it more of that open-ended that we need to get the information that you want.
And we get that information in the survey anyway.
Right. So then it's not super repetitive for them either, which makes them more likely to not get angry.
Which is a good thing. I also wanted to ask one question based upon something that you said, Cosman. So you said something about, if they're in college or not. And one of her inclusion criteria is that they're currently a Division I athlete. But do you think that it would be worthwhile to expand her inclusion criteria to say that they, and I'd have to think about how to word this appropriately, so that way we weren't getting people that were college athletes 6, 10, 20, 40 years ago to say it, but say like recently former collegiate athlete, because if they got one in their junior or senior year or whatever, they've maybe graduated, but they had to go through their return to learn and return to play criteria while in college. Mm-hmm. Or do you think that that just makes it, I'm just trying to think of ways to expand her population potentially, instead of just limiting it only to college kids, as long as we say that they had to get it while being a collegiate athlete, and that it was within the last 24 months, then it wouldn't be maybe like we'd potentially get the juniors and seniors instead of only getting, freshmen and sophomores and maybe some juniors. I don't know. Does that make it too difficult? Mary Catherine, are you opposed to this? You and I haven't talked about it. I just brought it up because based upon what Dr. Kaufman said, I was like, oh, maybe we do need to think about that.
So, do you think instead of strictly limiting it to Division I, we should do all NCAA and get D1, D2, and D3? Do you think that might help?
That would definitely help you getting people, but that is a totally different experience. I mean, people don't necessarily like to admit that, but
USA is different. Like Southern Miss to here was a different experience.
Right. So I feel like that might be, in terms of that generalizability, that might be tough because they are very different.
Well, I think I personally think there's enough places where there's going to be variability depending on contact versus non-contact sport, women's versus men's sports, on, that I don't think I'd add another layer of that to it if it were me. I don't think you're going to have, I don't know for sure, but I don't think you're going to have that much trouble if you use D1 across the board, because you're not saying D1 football only. I think you'll have a good enough sample to pull from of people that would be willing to participate. And I think that if it were me, I would say that the inclusion criteria would be a Division I NCAA athlete at the time the concussion occurred, and the concussion has to have been within the last 24 months. I don't think that's a problem at all, personally.
I agree. And I actually think that brings up a good point, because you may have freshmen that are a current NCAA athlete, but they actually got their injury in high school, right? And they would technically qualify based on the inclusion criteria right now.
Mhm.
And that also gets kind of sticky because even though their return to play things are the same, right? Policies are different, resources are different. So I think framing it like that, where they got their concussion while at an NCAA institution within the last 2 years, is a way to broaden your sample, but keep it focused enough that it doesn't introduce a whole lot of other variables. Because if you're using social media and things and doing Zoom interviews, these people don't have to be from Texas State, right? They can be from anywhere. So I think your sample or your participant pool is actually very large. If you think about the reach of like the Women in AT Facebook group, or like you're going to be able to reach a lot of people. So I think as long as you frame it in a way where it's a collegiate concussion that has happened within the last 2 years, whether or not they are currently a collegiate athlete, I think that's probably the best case scenario.
And I guess my next question was, do you think it matters FBS versus FCS or just any D1? NCAA is confusing with all of that, but okay.
I mean, for a follow-up, for sure, it'd be super interesting to look at if the experiences are different between FBS and FCS or D1 to D3, right? Like those are things that are really interesting, but I think
probably
they're
should
way
be done.
outside the scope.
Yeah,
It's just a lot.
yeah, I agree. I mean, we could try to negate people, but then really I think what we're gonna cut out is Texas State based upon, I think, what you really want to look at. You'll want to go with the upper division, which takes out all of the smaller universities. But I do think if we just say Division I, honestly, there's people that don't know the difference either.
Yeah.
They're just like, well, they're all Division I. And I'm like, oh, you're sweet. It's not.
And you could always
But-
ask in the demos, you could always ask a question about what conference they're in.
Yeah.
Not what school or anything like that, but you could always ask what conference they're in, because then that might give you a little bit of that like future
What
research.
would give
next
you the
step.
D1 to D3 ratio? Yeah.
Yeah, and it would give you that like Power 5 versus the little people, right? It would give you a little bit of that connotation, at least, even if you can't answer the question, and it may at least help you see if anything's there that might be worthwhile.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So, yeah. So what I'm hearing, Division I, add conferences, had to happen in college in the last 24 months. Male, female, whatever age, it just had to happen in that kind of fluent in English, because I also don't.
Yeah, I don't speak anything but English.
Other languages.
Took 5 years of Spanish in high school and don't remember any of it.
So, yeah. Any other questions about methodology or concerns about stuff, things like for the questions based upon what we said, like how we're going to use the information? Do the research questions seem like plausible? Are they okay? Or do we need to think about rewording some of those?
I would potentially look at rewording 3 and 4 just because they are written quantitatively. Like you have that information, but they're yes/no questions. So instead of does clinical presentation influence the types of experiences, I might say something like, how does clinical presentation influence, right? Because they're just written as a quantitative question. So that's part of what introduced those questions about how are you going to use that quantitative information, right? Because it looks like you could do a mixed methods based on those research questions.
Let's change that.
Yeah, no, it's not.
Anything else? Any other questions for her?
The only other thing I have is just for your own sanity's sake. The timeline of data collection and data analysis is very, very, very long, which is a good thing because you gave yourself a lot of room. But the bad thing is you just gave yourself the opportunity to do an interview in February, have to transcribe that interview, have to analyze that interview, and have to write your chapters before April, which is a lot. So I would almost recommend keeping your interviews to the fall.
Okay.
So that way you can just be done with them. And usually it's easier to get interviews than you think. Like people sign up for that stuff pretty quickly because they're pretty low bandwidth on the person's part. And so if you're going to get them, you'll probably get them pretty fast. And then the transcription part is what takes the longest. So if you can give yourself that wiggle room of one, transcribe as you go, but two, have that wiggle room of like winter break to kind of like reset and refocus. And then you can really hit analysis when you come back from winter break. That'll give you a lot more time.
And the brunt of track season is in the spring too. So that might.
Yes. So I would just think about that from your own sanity's sake. Like I completely applaud the giving yourself room and the giving yourself time, right? But you also only have so much time. So I think just be wary of that you don't want to over commit yourself, because then like you literally might have an interview in February if you haven't reached saturation, you know what I mean? Like I would rather you start recruiting more in like November than waiting to see what you get in February and then getting stuck. Does that make sense? I don't know what others' thoughts are on that, but
I think that makes sense.
Oof.
Yeah, because I don't think that, I also agree. I think that you won't have a whole lot of trouble getting people to agree to do interviews. And the interviews are, I mean, they're fairly quick to record and very time intensive and labor intensive to do anything with. And so I agree. Since you don't have a specifically, large number in mind that you need, because you're not trying to do quantitative comparisons, you're trying to look for themes qualitatively, then I think it makes perfect sense to front end the time frame for collecting the interviews so that you can back end the workload for all the other steps that are involved in that.
Yeah, collecting the data is the easy part, because literally
with this kind of a project,
the hard part is the scheduling, but once they're scheduled, you do it and it's done and you've got the data, right? And so it's the transcription will take way more time than you think it's going to take. So just be wary of that. Like you want to give yourself that breathing room for transcription in particular, not so much for data collection, because you shouldn't have a problem with the data collection part.
I will say that based upon my experience anyway, it goes much faster as you do it. Your first one is kind of slow and painful, and then they kind of speed up once you figure out how to use a foot pedal or do all that other stuff.
I told her some of my tips. I used to just like listen to it in headphones and just dictate it and then fix my dictation.
Ooh, you're so smart. Nice.
It only took me 3 or 4 projects for Jana for me to figure that one out. A couple hundred interviews, and I finally got smart about it.
Yeah, I like it. That's even better. Screw the foot pedal.
Yeah, no,
And that one's free.
I couldn't get the hand-eye coordination, hand-foot coordination.
Hand-foot.
It wouldn't work.
Yeah. Got it. No, that's good. Gosh, I had another thing I was gonna say, and I can't remember what it was, so it must not be important. All right. Cool. So if everybody's good, I'm gonna throw her in a room and then we'll have a conversation. So I'll come get you in just a second.
Sounds good. Thank you.
You bet. Room 1, assign Mary Lee. All right. Go ahead and accept. And
she's gone.
Yep, I'm also gonna pause again. So in case we say anything that you need. So the things, and I'm gonna send you the notes that I took as well as this recording. So that way you have that information to reference. The things, like I said, that we need to do, and Cosman said that based upon what we talked about today, that's how she's going to format her notes on the chapters. And I think she told you the same thing. So that way it's not just general stuff. And so hopefully you'll get that in the next day or two. I don't know how long it'll take her to get that stuff like specific. And then Osborne will send his stuff as well. And I will send a couple things, but I'm leaving like the methods and stuff kind of to Cosman more to make her
Okay.
edits, because since she knows that stuff a little bit better, and then just adding in the stuff that we talked about. But their main thing is just making sure, one thing that they said is making sure that we really look at the protocol and like how we're going to separate people or how we're going to recruit them in, and that our questions and that the script is really like where we want it to be, because we don't want to have to go back in and do an addendum just for like one or two things on the protocol. So we'll need to write that up and then make sure we send it out and get an approval from everybody that, yeah, this is kind of what we talked about, and make sure it's in line. Because the script, because it's semi-scripted, we can make small changes to it without having to get approval. But like protocol stuff, we kind of have to like stay that way. If we say we're going to pick people one way, we kind of have to pick them that way, or whatever. So, and that kind of stuff. But like I said, I'll send you this stuff. And then if you have questions, let me know. The other thing that I was going to say is we're supposed to be meeting tomorrow. Would you rather just take time to work on this stuff, or would you have like, do you think you'll have stuff to meet about, or?
I don't think I'll have anything to meet about. I have all of the IRB caught up until we start putting stuff in,
Okay.
like our chapter stuff. So like all of
Yeah,
that is done.
Okay.
And I uploaded my city stuff to that today.
Great.
So
Okay. And I can put mine in there too. Or did I already share it with you? I can't remember.
you haven't shared it with me
Okay.
yet.
I'll just put it in there. Did you invited me to it? Yes. Did
I
you
think
add
I
me on
did.
there? Okay.
Yeah, you're under key personnel.
Okay. And you made sure I have like full, like not just
Let's
see it, but I can make edits.
Hold on, I'm about to
That's okay.
share this with you.
So click on the, yeah, hit my name. Yeah, that thing. Yeah, no, you're right. The thing. Scroll.
Oh, full
Black.
access.
There you go. Yep, you got to click on that guy.
Okay, and then done. Okay.
Yeah. So now I probably just got an email. I'll look. But if not, I'll try to get on. And if I can't get on, then I'll let you know. So that way I
Okay.
can address it, and then I'll upload my stuff to it. So that should be
Do
good.
I need to add Dr. Osborne to this section?
If you want to, you can. Like I said, it's not always necessary, but the reason why you would add them is so that way they can review the stuff. But if we're just going to email everything to them instead of like say, hey, go into this and check it out, there's pluses and minuses to doing that. But in general, the chances of him addressing things would be pretty small. Yeah, like questions and stuff like that. So it's up to you. Usually people only put their chair on there. Well, I shouldn't say usually. I guess it depends upon what's happening.
Yeah. I think that would be okay, just because we email back and forth with them a lot. So
Yeah.
okay.
So too. All right. Anything else?
I think we're good.
All right. Well, good job. Be very proud of yourself. It is a big deal to get it done, man. And you did a very nice job in your presentation.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Do you feel okay about some of the changes that we talked about?
Yeah. I think they're really good changes.
Yeah, I think it'll make a difference. And when you're reading this Word doc, if you're like, what is she talking about? Just email me and like send the thing that I said, and I'll be like, oh, this is what I meant. So,
Okay,
yeah.
gotcha.
Okay.
Hey, well, I'll see you at our next meeting.
Awesome. Good job.
Great.
I'll send you
Thank
that and the recording.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
You bet. Bye-bye.
All right, bye.